plant physiology and transport in plants. Now let us consider means of transport. In case of plants, there is no circulatory system. In plant body, there is no circulatory system, as we observe in case of animals where we have blood vascular system. In this case, there is no circulatory system, but plants require transportation of certain materials. And what are the materials normally transported? Water. Also, different kinds of mineral ions, about 17 mineral ions are transported, are essential for plants' survival. Besides that, photosynthetes, whatever is produced, sugars produced during photosynthesis must be transported to all living cells in the plant body, and also different kinds of phytohormones from sites of synthesis to target locations where physiological effects of hormones are observed. Now, so plants are without circulatory system, water, mineral ions, 17 essential mineral ions, and also beneficial, 4 beneficial mineral ions are transported to different parts. Roots absorb water and minerals and transport them to aerial parts. And photosynthetes, during photosynthesis, green cells synthesize sugars and they are transported to all living cells. And also phytohormones produced at different locations in the plant body must be transported to different target locations in the plant. And the transport can be short distance transport and it may be long distance transport. The transport may be short distance transport or long distance transport. For short distance transport, it may require energy or may not require energy. If it is without requiring energy, this will be called passive. If it requires energy, it will be called active transport. Passive, for passive we have diffusion, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, imbibition. In active transport, we have itself, the method itself is called active transport. This is facilitated by protein pumps. For long distance transport, this is normally described as translocation and it may be a negative force called pull. This is observed in xylem transport and this is positive force called push. This is observed in phloem transport. మొక్కల్లో రవాణా కొరకు ప్రసరణ వ్యవస్థ లేకపోయినా నీరు, ఖనిజ అయాన్లు, 17 ఖనిజ అయాన్లు, కిరణజన్య సంయోగ క్రియలో ఏర్పడినటువంటి చక్కెరలు, వృక్ష హార్మోన్లు వివిధ భాగాలకు రవాణా చేయబడాలి. ఈ రవాణా అనేది స్వల్ప దూర రవాణా, దీర్ఘ రవాణాని ట్రాన్స్లోకేషన్ అనే పేరుతో పిలుస్తాం. ఇది దారు వ్యవస్థ ద్వారా జరిగేటువంటిది. ఇది రుణాత్మకమైనటువంటి పుల్, కర్షణ మూలంగా జరుగుతుంది. అలాగే పోషక కణజాలం ద్వారా జరిగేది ధనాత్మకమైనటువంటి శక్తి వలన జరుగుతుంది. ఈ స్వల్ప దూర రవాణా నిష్క్రియాత్మకంగా ఉండొచ్చు, సక్రియాత్మకంగా ఉండొచ్చు. ఏటీపీ వినియోగించబడితే సక్రియాత్మకం, ఏటీపీ వినియోగం లేకపోతే నిష్క్రియాత్మకం అని తీసుకుంటాం. ఇది విసరణ, సులభతర విసరణ, అలాగే ద్రవాభిసరణ అండ్ నిపానం అనేటువంటివి దీనిలో వస్తాయి. నౌ టు let us consider different means of transport in plant body. Different means of transport in plant body. First let us consider short distance transport. స్వల్ప దూరాలకి జరిగే రవాణాని షార్ట్ డిస్టెన్స్ ట్రాన్స్పోర్ట్. స్వల్ప దూరానికి జరిగే రవాణా. First, diffusion, means of transport. Now we are considering first is diffusion, visarana. Diffusion does not require a living system. No living system is required. It can occur in non-living system also. It means it can occur in non-living system and also can occur in living system. And what is the importance of diffusion in plants? Gaseous exchange and distribution of CO2 and O2. O2 and CO2 in plant body is only through diffusion. Without this, plants cannot survive. So diffusion is essential for gaseous exchange, and the respiratory required oxygen, CO2 required in photosynthesis, both move in the plant body through diffusion only. And diffusion is a passive process. Diffusion is a passive process, does not require ATP energy. Diffusion is a passive process, it does not require metabolic energy, ATP. And this is downhill. This is downhill or along the gradient from higher concentration to lower concentration. This is movement from higher concentration to lower concentration, and this is a passive process, and it can be, this is due to the random thermal movement of atoms or molecules in the substance, and this may occur in all three states of the matter, and the rate of diffusion of gases is more when we compare with liquids. So diffusion of liquids is rather slow and diffusion of gases will be faster, and if we consider diffusion of solids, it will be slowest. So this is increasing order of diffusion as far three states of matter is concerned, and a gas can diffuse into another gas, and a liquid can diffuse into another liquid, and either a gas or liquid can easily diffuse into a solid, and a gas can diffuse easily into a solid or a liquid can easily diffuse into a solid, but it is rare and not common that one solid diffuses into another solid. So these two can diffuse easily into a solid, but a solid into solid is rare, and of solids may be common. And what decides the rate of diffusion in case of plants? What materials can diffuse into plant body? As far plant body is concerned, into a living cell across the membrane, what can diffuse? So lipid soluble substances can easily pass through. Lipid soluble substances can easily pass through the plasma membrane. Lipid soluble substances can diffuse easily through plasma membrane. The second category of substances that can diffuse into living cell are neutral solutes without charge, without cationic, without ion charge, that is plus charge or minus charge, monovalent or divalent cations, anions, they cannot diffuse through the lipid part of the membrane. Lipid soluble substances, neutral solutes, and solutes, these can diffuse through the membrane. And what cannot diffuse through the membrane? What is water soluble? Any solute that is soluble in water cannot diffuse through the membrane. Similarly, charged solutes or solutes in anion or cationic state cannot diffuse through the plasma membrane. So, these substances, lipid soluble substances, diffuse easily. Neutral solutes also diffuse easily through the membrane, and any solute with hydrophilic moiety or that is soluble in water cannot diffuse through the lipid part of the membrane, and solutes with charge, anionic or cationic condition, they cannot diffuse through the membrane. Concentration, membrane permeability, temperature, pressure normally influence rate of diffusion. విసరణ పదార్థం 3 స్థితులలో కూడా విసరణ చెందగలుగుతుంది. ఘనస్థితి కంటే ద్రవస్థితిలో వేగంగాను, ద్రవస్థితి కంటే వాయుస్థితిలో పదార్థాల విసరణ ఇంకా ఎక్కువ వేగంగాను జరుగుతుంది. ఘన పదార్థంలోకి ద్రవ పదార్థాలు లేదా వాయు పదార్థాల విసరణ సాధారణంగాను, ఘన పదార్థంలోకి ఘన పదార్థ విసరణ స్వల్పంగాను, అసలు జరగకపోవటం కానీ చూడొచ్చు. ఇక సజీవమైనటువంటి మొక్క కణంలోనికి ఏ రకమైన పదార్థాలు విసరణ ద్వారా ప్రవేశం పొందుతాయి? లిపిడ్లలో కరిగేటువంటి పదార్థాలన్నీ కూడా ఇవి సులభమైనటువంటి విసరణ మార్గంలో కణంలోనికి ప్రవేశిస్తాయి. కణత్వచాన్ని దాటడం కోసం లిపిడ్లలో కరిగేటువంటి పదార్థాలు, తటస్థంగా ఉండేటువంటి ద్రావితాలు కణంలోనికి పారగమ్యత ద్వారా ప్రవేశిస్తాయి. అలాగే నీటిలో కరిగే పదార్థాలు విసరణ చెందలేవు. అదే రకంగా యానయాన్, క్యాటయాన్, ధన లేదా రుణావేశం కలిగినటువంటి ద్రావితాలు కూడా కణంలోకి ప్రవేశించలేవు. ఉష్ణోగ్రత, పీడనము, త్వచము యొక్క పారగమ్యతలు విసరణని ప్రభావితం చేస్తాయి. Second method, facilitated diffusion. The second means of transport is facilitated diffusion. Normal diffusion can occur in living and non-living, whereas facilitated diffusion can be seen only in living cells. సజీవ కణాల్లో మాత్రమే ఈ సులభతర విసరణ అనేది గమనించవచ్చు. If we consider these are what can diffuse and these are what cannot diffuse, and facilitated diffusion, what can be transported through facilitated diffusion? 1, water soluble solutes or solutes with hydrophilic moiety. Solutes with hydrophilic moiety are transported. So, what is not possible, what cannot be transported through normal diffusion may need facilitated diffusion for transport. So, whatever is water soluble that can be transported through facilitated diffusion. are solutes with hydrophilic moiety. Next, solutes with charge. So these are ionic solutes can be transported through facilitated diffusion. This is a passive process. This is passive process, does not require metabolic energy. Like simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion is also a passive process. It does not require metabolic energy in the form of ATP. Now, how this can be, a substance can be transported through facilitated diffusion. This is passive process. It requires carrier proteins, and the protein carriers may be unipods or co-transporters. And when more ions in one direction, they are called sympads. In opposite direction, they are called antipodes. Facilitated diffusion is possible for water-soluble solutes or solutes with hydrophilic moiety, solutes with charge or solutes in ionic state, and this is a passive process like simple diffusion. It requires carrier proteins. It is not through lipid part of the plasma membrane, and the carrier proteins are called unipods if only one ion is transported. One solute in one direction if the transport is one solute in one direction, this will be, the carrier protein is called uniporter and transport is called uniport. And when two or more ions are transported in the same direction, it will be called symport. In opposite direction, it will be called antiport. And another kind of carrier proteins also there, and they are called porins. These porins are seen in outer membranes of chloroplast, mitochondria, and in some bacteria. These are channel proteins. The channel proteins allow passage or transport of medium-sized solutes and also solutes with hydrophilic moiety. These may be gated channels or open channels, and so these help in facilitated diffusion. What cannot diffuse into the cell may be transported either by facilitated diffusion or by active transport. Let us consider how the transport proteins work and what are the other conditions here. Let us consider this as a membrane, plasma membrane, and this is outside the membrane and this is inside the membrane. This is the carrier protein and this is the solute to be transported across the membrane. So first the solute binds to the catalytic site of the carrier protein. So this is the first event. There is a solute to be transported available outside the membrane. This binds to the catalytic site or active site, and as a result the carrier protein undergoes conformational change, it rotates so that the ion is exposed to aquatic medium in the other side, then it is released. So this is how the solute is transported from one side through the other side. So first it binds to the active site and the carrier protein undergoes conformational change. It rotates and as a result the solute is exposed to aquatic medium or cytoplasm or protoplasm in the other side of the membrane. Once it comes into contact, it is released. If only one solute molecule is transported at a time, then it will be called uniport, and if more than one solute molecules are transported at the same time, it will be co-transport. If it is in the same direction, it will be symport, and if it is in the opposite direction, it will be antiport. And these require carrier protein. This is the carrier protein. Because it is a carrier protein, it is made up of amino acid residues. The amino acids have side chains, and the side chains can readily react with inhibitors. So, inhibitors will react with the side chains of amino acid residues. As a result, the process of transport can be stopped. And also we have saturation effect. What is the saturation effect? When all the carrier proteins are engaged in transport, the maximum transport will be taking place and there is no carrier protein free and not occupied by or not involved in transport. So saturation effect will be there in case of facilitated diffusion, and there will be effect of inhibitors also in case of facilitated diffusion. As far simple diffusion is concerned, there is no saturation effect and also there is no inhibition by inhibitors. Now let us consider active transport. Now let us take up active transport. Like facilitated diffusion, this also require carrier proteins. This also require carrier proteins, and once it is made up of carrier proteins, like the carrier proteins in active transport are similar to carrier proteins of the facilitated diffusion. Both are made up of amino acid residues, and once these are made up of amino acid residues, their side chains can react with the inhibitors. Their side chains can react with inhibitors. So here also inhibitors can inhibit the process of facilitated diffusion. Inhibitors can diffuse the process of active transport. Here the carrier proteins are normally described as pumps. The carrier proteins are normally described as pumps. They require metabolic energy. They require metabolic energy ATP. The ATP is hydrolyzed, producing ADP, inorganic phosphate, and energy. Using this energy, solutes are transported. Why energy is required in active transport and why it is not required in facilitated diffusion and also simple diffusion? Simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion are downhill processes. What is meant by downhill process? This is along the gradient from, that means from higher concentration to lower concentration. This is from higher concentration to lower concentration, that is what is along the gradient or downhill process, whereas the active transport is uphill process. This is against the concentration gradient. The active transport is uphill process. This is against the concentration gradient from lower to higher concentration. From lower to higher concentration, it requires metabolic energy. The consumption of ATP. ATP is hydrolyzed, producing energy. Using that energy, different solutes move from higher concentration, from lower concentration to higher concentration. This is described as uphill process or against the gradient. And in active transport, the carrier proteins may be symphodes and also antipodes will be there. Both symphodes will be there and also antipodes will be there. And this process is because carrier proteins are there, like facilitated diffusion. This process of transport is affected by inhibitors. Here also the effect of inhibitors can be seen, and the facilitated diffusion has a saturation effect due to presence of carrier proteins, and active transport also has carrier proteins. So it too shows saturation effect, that all carrier proteins are involved in transport and there is no free protein, carrier protein available for transport of additional solute molecules. And the process of facilitated diffusion is highly selective, and similarly the active transport is also highly selective process. The active transport is also a highly selective process. We have considered the transport of different kinds of substances. We have considered transport of different kinds of substances across the membrane into plant cell, and the methods are simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion and active transport. For movement of water, 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗺 will be present in the membrane. 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗺 will be present in the membrane. As far movement of water is concerned, 𝗂𝗏𝗄𝗺 will be there. This is the plasma membrane. First, let us consider different kinds of solutes. We have lipid soluble, neutral solutes without hydrophilic moiety. They simply diffuse through the lipid part of the membrane. They simply diffuse through lipid part of the membrane. So these are the substances to be transported across the membrane into the living plant cell, and the process will be simple diffusion. The process is simple diffusion. Now let us consider solutes soluble in water, and also ionic solutes or solutes with charge. solutes with charge. The third and fourth kind cannot diffuse across the membrane. So they require another means of transport. And what is the other means of transport? It can be, these are carrier proteins in the membrane, and this may be either by facilitated diffusion, and these are our carrier proteins. So, a substance soluble in water, not soluble in lipid, cannot diffuse. So, it requires either facilitated diffusion or another possibility is there. And where this process, facilitated diffusion, will occur, this will be from higher to lower. This will be from higher concentration to lower concentration. Let us consider few more solutes. Soluble in water, let me write from higher to lower. This is also from higher to lower. So, what is soluble in water are with hydrophilic moiety, from lower to higher. And it will be ionic solutes or solutes with charge from lower to higher. These are the pumps, and through pumps these kinds of solutes are transported, and this is called active transport. These are the pumps. So these are the three kinds of diffusions, three kinds of transport taking place across the membrane. First is simple diffusion, whatever is lipid soluble can diffuse through, and also neutral solutes can diffuse through the membrane from lipid part. And in facilitated diffusion, what cannot diffuse simply requires some kind of help for transport, and that is with the help of proteins. The soluble in water, any solute soluble in water from higher concentration to lower require facilitated diffusion, that can be transported through facilitated diffusion. And ionic solutes are solutes with charge from higher to lower, they can be transported through facilitated diffusion. And water soluble substances are substances with hydrophilic moiety, when they are to be transported from lower to higher concentration, or ionic solutes are solutes with charge, when from lower to higher concentration, if they are to be transported, they require carrier proteins that work by spending metabolic energy. These are called pumps. Now to facilitated diffusion. And this is the membrane. This is the carrier protein involved in facilitated diffusion. This is the solute. It binds to the catalytic site on the carrier protein. It rotates, that is normally described as conformational change, and it is exposed to medium on the other side. So this is the first frame where the solute binds to catalytic site, and as a result the carrier protein undergoes conformational change. It rotates and the solute is exposed to medium on the other side. Now it is released and the carrier protein is free to accept one more solute. This is uniport. Regarding all three kinds of transport proteins involved in facilitated diffusion, only one solute is moving in the other direction. This will be called transport is uniport and transport protein is uniporter. Now, two solutes move in the same direction, C and D. This will be called symport. When two solutes are transported by the carrier protein in the same direction, it is called, the transport is called symport, the transport protein is called symporter, and it may be from outside to inside or inside to outside, both ways. This also will be symport. The next kind of co-transport will be one ion moves towards inside, whereas other ion moves to outside. This is called, this kind of transport is called antiport or counter transport. And the carrier protein is called antiporter. So this represent the three types of carrier proteins involved in facilitated diffusion. One is uniport, one ion is transported or one solute is transported in one direction only. Symport, two solutes or more than two are transported in the same direction from outside to in or inside to out. This will be symport. The transport is symport and the protein is called symporter. And the third kind of facilitated diffusion will be antiport. Transport is antiport and the protein is antiporter, where the ions move, the solutes are transported in opposite direction at the same time. Now let us compare different kinds of transport, different means of transport. Here we have property, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion. The third means is active transport. Let us consider requirement of membrane proteins is the process highly selective, is saturation effect is there, type of transport ATP required. Let us add one more. Part of the plasma membrane involved, part of the plasma membrane involved. And now the property, first property, requirement of membrane proteins, not in case of simple diffusion, there is no requirement of any kind of membrane protein in case of simple diffusion. Why? What part of the membrane is involved? Lipid layer, bilayer of lipids is involved here. This is the reason no carrier protein is required here. Now for facilitated diffusion, carrier proteins are required, membrane proteins are required, uniports, symports and antiports are required here. Now to the other process, third kind, active transport. This also require carrier proteins. These carrier proteins are called pumps. The process is highly selective because whatever is soluble in bilayer of lipids can diffuse through. So this simple diffusion is not selective. Simple diffusion is not selective. Now let us consider the second kind of transport. Facilitated diffusion is selective because carrier proteins are involved. This process is highly selective. And active transport, the third means of transport, is also highly selective due to involvement of carrier proteins. So once this is there, saturation effect will be there and also selective nature will be there. Now, is there transport saturation? There is no transport saturation because the solute can pass through any part of the bilayer of lipids, whereas in facilitated diffusion, once carrier protein is available, then only transport can occur. So this shows transport saturation, so also active transport. Is the process uphill transport? Of course, simple diffusion is downhill transport, so this property is not applicable to simple diffusion. Now, facilitated diffusion is also downhill process, so facilitated diffusion is not active. Now, the active transport is uphill transport and this requires ATP. ATP is not required here. This is also not required here. It is required only in case of active transport. Now let us consider what part of the membrane is involved in facilitated diffusion. We have carrier proteins here and also channel proteins. We have carrier proteins and channel proteins involved in facilitated diffusion. What part of the membrane is involved in active transport? Here also we have carrier proteins and these proteins normally described as pumps. These proteins are normally described as pumps. So this is the comparison of three means of transport. The first being simple diffusion. No living system is required for this, whereas facilitated diffusion and active transport require a living system and it can occur in non-living also. And what is its importance? In case of plant life, all gases diffuse in the plant body and diffusion is the only method where each and every living cell receives CO2 and also O2. Facilitated diffusion and active transport both are highly selective and there is effect of transport saturation and also inhibitors can inhibit the process. Inhibitors have no effect in case of simple diffusion, whereas the inhibitors can stop the process of transport by carrier proteins, whether they are involved in facilitated diffusion or they are involved in active transport now described as pumps. Now let us consider some model questions. Transport of solutes against the concentration gradient is through what kind of means? Is it through simple diffusion, or is it through facilitated diffusion, or is it through osmosis, or is it through active transport? Now let us consider the transport of solutes against the concentration gradient. This is not through simple diffusion, because this is always along the gradient. Facilitated diffusion is also along the gradient or downhill. This is downhill process, this is also downhill process, and osmosis is also along the gradient, and this is again downhill process through aquaporins. So this is downhill, this is downhill, this is also downhill, and this is against concentration gradients means uphill, and this only is the uphill process that requires metabolic energy. This requires metabolic energy. So our best answer in this case is active transport. This is against concentration gradient. During photosynthesis, the CO2 reaches the mesophyll cells due to osmosis, active transport, facilitated diffusion, and diffusion. During photosynthesis, large volumes of gases are exchanged between plant and atmosphere. The CO2 reaches the mesophyll cells due to what? Osmosis is normally for liquids and solvents, and universal solvent water. So the osmotic movement normally represents entry or exit of water into the living cell. As for active transport, this is for solutes against concentration gradient, and there is no such thing involved here. So there is nothing against, no uphill activity here, facilitated diffusion, and here carrier proteins in both cases, second and third options, carrier proteins are involved and different solutes are transported, and gaseous movement inside the plant body is only through simple diffusion. So fourth option is the best one. Fourth option is the best one. Selective nature of carrier proteins involved in facilitated diffusion and active transport are responsible for dash nature of the membrane. Selective nature of carrier proteins involved in facilitated diffusion and active transport are responsible for this nature of the membrane. Semi-permeable, selectively permeable, permeable, impermeable. The carrier proteins are highly selective. They are involved in transport of particular carrier protein involved in transport of particular solute only, and this is because of this property the plasma membrane is normally described as what? It is semi-permeable, means osmosis is possible. Selectively permeable, of course it can be substituted by differentially permeable. So second is the best one. And permeable means allowing passage to all. Semi-permeable means allowing passage to solvents. So this is passage for solvents, and this is allowing transport of some solutes and preventing transport of others. Whereas permeable means allowing all, impermeable means not allowing transport of any kind of solute. Now let us try to conclude the transport, means of transport in plants. As for means of transport, first, what is to be transported in plant body? Water. Through what part water is transported? Through aquaporins. 8 different proteins, ring-like proteins, are arranged forming a channel through which water moves across the membrane, and these aquaporins allow movement of water, what we call osmosis, and also water soluble solutes. And because of this, the membrane nature is normally described as semi-permeable. The membrane is called semi-permeable. So water movement, because water can enter into the cell and also from the cell it can come out, and the membrane nature is described as semi-permeable. This means allowing solvents. Of course, universal solvent being water. Now different kinds of minerals, different kinds of mineral substances, and they may be neutral and lipid soluble. So different kinds of minerals must be transported across the membrane from different cells and between cells and also tissues. And for neutral solutes and lipid soluble substances, the means of transport is diffusion or simple diffusion. Which part of the membrane, in case of plasma membrane, is involved in this process? Bilayer of lipids is involved here. Now, the mineral ions with charge. Now let us consider mineral ions, how these are transported across the membrane. How mineral ions are transported across the membrane. And once ions are there, 2 considerations we have to look into. One is from higher to lower. The other consideration is from lower to higher. So mineral ions are there. The mineral ions from higher to lower, since these are ions, simple diffusion is not possible. Now we have what is called facilitated diffusion. From lower to higher, it requires metabolic energy. Metabolic energy is required, and this is called active transport. So in case of this kind of transport from lower to higher, metabolic energy is required. This is called active transport. From higher to lower, this is called facilitated diffusion, and both require carrier proteins. And not only mineral ions, but also water soluble substances or substances with hydrophilic moiety. They require either facilitated diffusion or active transport. So with this, let us conclude our topic, means of transport in plants.